Yes, I'm Charles Bailey. I work in the Developer Experience London team, which is part of Developer Experience, which is kind of a new thing to Bloomberg last year. Well, developers have always had experiences at Bloomberg, but now we have a team to manage their expectations. Try and avoid the prime checks.
I didn't realize this was stand-up comedy.
I did not prepare
It's actually
well.
sit-down comedy.
And yes, so we try and support some tools and services that help developers get their job done. We're also developers ourselves, so we get to try our own tools.
I imagine it's more than just installing NetBeans or Eclipse.
We do neither of those things actually, managing approved source control repositories, making available training material, code review tools, things like that, and generally responding to kind of needs as we see them or as we're told they are.
Okay, cool. Kris, what do you do? Can you introduce yourself a bit to the audience? There's like lots of people from the UK. I don't know how known you are in the UK, or Estonia, or Spain, or Italy.
So my name is Kris Buytaert. I've been working with and in open source for the past more than 2 decades. What I mostly do is help companies deliver software and deploy software with open source tools. Somewhere along the line, I kind of co-founded the DevOps movement. That was an accident. We wanted to do a small conference with about 60 people in Ghent, and now kind of went global. And
it happens.
Yeah, it tends to happen when I start a conference. So I help people using open source to build their businesses.
Okay, cool.
I prefer to call it businesses as opposed to startups.
It's actually a good idea to call it businesses instead of startups. Lien, what business do you work for? What businesses do you work for? Because you're a busy bee.
So I'm a web developer at DataCamp. For those who don't know DataCamp, it is an online learning platform, especially for data science. So there are courses in Python and in R. So I recently joined them. I joined them in December. Before that, and still a little bit, I was a coach at Le Wagon, which is a coding bootcamp. So in 9 weeks, beginners can learn Ruby on Rails and hopefully go, and often what they do is become a junior developer at a company after 9 weeks. So, yeah.
Okay, cool. You can perhaps answer us what open source software is used at DataCamp.
Okay, so almost, I think everything is open source at DataCamp. So the app itself, so the platform, has a Ruby on Rails backend, and our front end is entirely in Angular. So those two just speak to each other. And of course, the tool itself, what we use, what we give our lectures in, is Python and R, which are also open source languages. So basically, the product we have that we make our money with is thanks to open source, and it's all on open source tools.
Okay. Kris, you also mentioned that you're doing business on top of open source. Which open source software do you use?
All of it. It's really difficult to ask me what kind of open source stuff I use.
Okay. Which one is your favorite to work with? All of it.
All of it. No, not all of it, but there's so many tools that I work with that are really fun to work with, that really give me a lot of pleasure if I can work with them as opposed to with other stuff which I don't do anymore. But I think at Inuits we use only open source. There's not a single piece of proprietary software that we use. With our customers we try to do the same thing. If you look at a couple of stacks which we manage, which could be considered as small startups, then it's pretty much a standard LAMP stack, using tools like Jenkins and Puppet for infrastructure management, and managing and monitoring those stacks completely with open source tools. That works fine.
Okay, Charles, at Bloomberg, Bloomberg is a big company, and Is
Yeah,
open
so-
source familiar there, or?
We use a lot of open source stuff. It's kind of a bit daunting actually, because there are so many people using so many different kind of things. I can't possibly speak for everyone, and it's definitely not the case that we're entirely open source by any means. Personally, as a developer, I use and contribute to Git. I contribute very occasionally, but it's actually one of the reasons I joined Bloomberg. It's kind of like a little deciding factor when I spoke to the team. Say, yes, we're moving to Git. We're quite excited about it. We could do with some help. I thought they may not all be bad here. Maybe some good stuff. I spend a lot of time. I mean, we use Linux a lot. We have many Linux machines, and so obviously almost the entire environment there is open source. So I think of the things that I use every day, and it's kind of like Bash and Vim and Git, and we've got lots of developers who use Eclipse. I mean, there's tons of stuff. I know that there are teams in Bloomberg that are heavy contributors to Solar, which is a kind of a great search thing that I know very little about. And yes, I'm probably not familiar with most of our open source efforts, just because we're such kind of a large company, so many sort of disparate challenges and tools and platforms that we use. So,
Is it like inside of Bloomberg? Is there one Linux distribution to use, or can developers choose which one they deploy on, or do you develop on the Linux machines, or is it on a Windows machine, or is even there the freedom?
oh man, that's a complex
Or
question. So we've got a lot of service software that we deploy on a number of Unixes, and one of those is a particular Red Hat Enterprise edition that I think we're upgrading to something slightly less ancient at the moment. But that's not the only kind of version of Linux that's available. People kind of like working outside some of the legacy service stuff do other stuff. I mean, Ubuntu is quite heavily used in people kind of testing stuff on VMs, or either a local VM or a kind of cluster of VMs. So yeah, no, there isn't a single.
It's like crispy. Okay, so there's no one version. Kris, you're more of a consulting role, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So you drop by at different companies. How do you see them use open source? Are there companies who get it and you're there like having an easy job, or are there other companies where it's a mess and they have to start from zero, or they're at infinity but in a bad kind of infinity?
Yes, all of them. I mean, all of the cases you just mentioned, I run into. There's a lot of companies where there's a small footprint. It's already the first steps with open source tooling, but they want to move faster and they need help and they need hands to do that. And then there's the other side where people are already actively working with open source stacks, contributing to them even, but they need more skills and more people. So it's really both ends of the spectrum where we run into. What I've seen, however, is that if you look 10 to 15 years ago, open source was not something people were openly talking about. You would not expect a large bank to say, hey, within the next 2 years, we want to be the core contributor of an open source project, or even start an open source project within the financial sector. This last year, we saw that kind of things happen. We actually had customers that, hey, come and help us, we want to do this thing within the next 2 years. We really want to have an open source product out there which we as a bank have built.
Wow. Can you give names of those banks, or is that like secret?
ING
Okay.
in Amsterdam.
What did they build?
They're still building it. The next 2 years.
Oh, okay.
It's their strategy, it's their target.
So they're
not
going to
there
open
yet.
it in 2 years, or it's already part?
Their
what they
goal
have is already
is
open?
to do this.
Okay.
They're still figuring out how to do it,
Okay.
and they might not succeed at doing it. But that's a different mindset from 10 years ago. Like, we don't want to use open source. We're not using it. The world has turned around now.
Yeah.
That's the difference. So we see all kinds of levels of open source adoption. In the startup world, by default people start with open source, whereas in a commercial world it still is looking at, can we really do this? Can we build on top of it? Can we trust it? It's still questions, the same questions as 10 to 15 years ago, they're still there, but now they're more open to adopting open source texts.
And where does the change in mindset come from? Is it because open source has matured, or is there?
My main feeling of the adoption is that the people who grew up with open source, I mean, the people that I went to university with, now end up having C-level positions. And they've never seen anything else. They've used it while they went to school, they used it at home, they were working on Linux for their thesis, they were building stuff after their hours, and now they realize, hey, this stuff we've been buying from vendors, it just doesn't work. Why don't we try it the way it does work at home?
I think Charles has some experience with that.
I'm not thinking of any vendors in particular.
Okay.
And together with that, obviously, the open source world has matured.
So it's not. In what way does open source world then have matured, or has matured?
Just look at the crowds we had this weekend. I think 2001 we had about 200 to 300 people at the other ULB campus, and that exploded now to, what was it, 6,000 to 7,000 people. We have spin-offs of FOSDEM the rest of the week where there's still 600 people showing up. So that there's a lot bigger community around the whole ecosystem where people are using the tools, building the tools, and obviously the more eyes you get, the more bugs you can find. So there's more people building it, there's more people working with it. It's growing.
Yeah. But that's still only engineers you're talking about. It's, I think there's more that happened to it. It's a bit companies selling open source like Red Hat, and to sell things, that's only engineers that do that. So I would think it's more than just engineers that are coming inside of the open source community.
Inside the communities, yes, but it's also those engineers that are now getting purchasing power or getting to decide what's happening into the organizations. The whole startup culture and the whole growth of technology is giving engineers much more power in the organization. Stefan Grady's book, New Kingmakers, Developers are the new king. That's pretty much what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
It's the developers who decide on where the direction of the company is going. Startups are built by developers. There are some marketing people and sales people around, but fundamentally without the developers it wouldn't happen. Whereas 10 to 15 years ago, people would probably say, we want you to build something for us and it's going to be like that. Whereas now the world is turning around and developers saying, look, no, we're going to build something. So they get to choose.
I like that because I'm an engineer myself. So.
Except at Bloomberg.
Sorry.
Except at Bloomberg?
Except for, sorry.
Except at you guys? Or is it different there?
We've got many engineers at Bloomberg. We also have many other people who I don't know what they are, but
what's the balance like?
They're definitely there selling stuff. What is the balance like?
5,000 developers and
1/3 developers.
It's 1/3 developers, which
Wow.
is pretty reasonable. I mean, we're a very technology heavy company.
well, we do have a lot of salespeople, right? We have a lot of customers.
We need a lot of salespeople because, like, they bring in the money that send us to places like this, buy us the computers we work with, and on all of the important stuff.
Okay. Do you contribute back to the community too?
Yes. So, I mean, I mentioned Solar before, which is kind of quite a big project within Bloomberg, and then personally also I contribute back to Git. You'll find there are lots of kind of pockets of contribution back in Bloomberg. So we've got kind of disparate teams who've all got kind of different interests, different needs, and so there are kind of quite a lot of open source projects that will get kind of contributions back. Although kind of the ones that I kind of come across. It's kind of occasional. It's kind of like one or two developers, and I think that's changing and improving. There's much more of an attitude that if we find something that doesn't work, we should by default contribute it back. And I think historically Bloomberg have been very kind of concerned about the intellectual property, so the code that we all write as part of the company, and making sure that's not leaked in any way. And that was kind of been a core concern. And there's been a change, and there's a continual bit of change, and now kind of letting code out outside the organisation is now something that's much more encouraged, and less kind of it rings slightly fewer panic alarms in the various other departments that are in charge of keeping us safe and secure and legally correct. So, but yes, it's a big organisation, and we've been kind of like developing continuously since the 80s, and so it's a change, and it's happening at the moment. It's been noticeable in the kind of 4 years that I've been at Bloomberg. So, was it fine?
Cool to see. Lien, you're only working for a few months at DataCamp. Is there also some contribution going back to the open source community?
I know for the R community, they do contribute to packages or write extra new packages to R. As for other things, currently the company is trying to go so fast that we are kind of neglecting it, I think. But I know we talked about it, that we should, the gems we use, the Python things we use, that if we see a bug, instead of hoping that it will be fixed, that we dedicate some time on it. So it's something we're gonna try to fit in the planning. And then otherwise, besides coding wise, I know when they were in New York, when they were there for the accelerator, they did do data science for women. So, and I am active in the Rails Girls Belgium. So we do try to get some of those things, and that's where I am still a bit like Neil said earlier, with the imposter syndrome, when I see things and I'm like, oh, I could fix this, or I could, and I'm like, well, do I want to contribute on an open source project? That will be out there. So I kind of need to get over that and just do it, which hopefully will come soon. And in the meantime, I try to help on a more social level.
Yeah.
That's kind of all I have right now.
Okay, cool. Kris, you said you were active for 20 years in open source. How have you matured in those 20 years? What was the Kris 20 years ago like?
Kris 20 years ago, wait, what year was that? Was testing Linux kernels and getting his name in there somehow. Then 5 years later, I probably was still doing stuff with distributed computing on a kernel level. And then I moved slowly higher on the stack via a side project doing actual Java development, that kind of stuff. I moved up higher in the stack if you look to contributions to infrastructure management and that kind of stuff. I wrote a lot of documentation. Even this week I got people sending me pull requests on documentation that was over 6 years old. It's kind of weird. And later on, I think the past 5 to 7 years, we've been mostly helping system administrators who are now using infrastructure as code, publishing their code. At least from my point of view. Next to that, I've been helping a lot of smaller teams using open source tools and actually starting new open source projects. I think within Inuits, we've started like 3 or 4 open source projects, some successful, some we just say after a couple of months like, nah, whatever. The idea we had was great, but now that tool has replaced it. But we also have built complete digital asset management platforms, complete lecturing platforms, completely in open source, which we built business on top of, but which is also completely reusable by other people. I've seen myself evolve from more of, and I see a lot of open source people that evolve from small contributions, documentation, helping on a mailing list, talking about your experiences, giving more talks about your experience, to starting complete new projects and trying to grow those.
You mentioned documentation, and typically for a developer that's a hard thing to do, documentation. How does Bloomberg work with documentation? There's probably policy around it. How do you enforce it? Is there a team like documentation experience or?
So we do have a training and documentation team, and I know we've been looking at a project to try and make some of our documentation more discoverable. I think one of the issues that we have is that there's a lot of different types of documentation, and so we have things like internally available APIs and general kind of documentation about how our environment's set up, and so how you need to kind of go about doing things. And some of the documentation kind of lends itself to one style of authoring or a different style, and so we've got kind of documentation into all sorts of dark corners, and it's kind of difficult to know what's up to date, what's kind of like endorsed by the team that actually owns it, what's been written by somebody just to kind of help people out. So yeah, it is a big problem, and I'm not sure what the solution is.
Well, we kind of have an expert here, so perhaps Kris can say what's the solution to that.
It depends. Our road documentation on projects I was actively involved in trying to build them, trying to get them running, and then documenting my experiences, and then getting feedback from other people who did what I tried, and we had other experiences, and then you end up having, well, at the end you pretty much have written a book on how to do something. I did that with Automotics, I did that with Xen, and eventually that became a book. But if you now look at software delivery, and if you document your code, then half of your API documentation should be generated. And then you should probably consider, if you're doing things like continuous delivery, get your documentation in the same pipeline, stuff like that. And that makes it easy. There's a really good talk from somebody at Red Hat who talks about how they do continuous delivery of the OpenStack documentation within and together with their teams. And that's a really good example of taking DevOps best practices and bringing them to documentation also. Something you might want to look into.
Yeah, I mean, again, the sort of disparate nature of teams within Bloomberg means that we've got kind of a whole kind of variety. So there are some teams that do generate a lot of API documentation from their code, and then other collaborative efforts kind of happens like this team are kind of delivering this function. We'd like to use a bit of functionality from that. So an inter-team conversation happens, an API kind of comes out of that, but kind of it's an expense for this team. They've helped this other team out, and so there often isn't kind of like a plan in advance or the time to kind of do things perfectly kind of the first time round. And I think probably some areas where our documentation isn't best might have come out of that sort of situation. So
I think Lien sees that also at DataCamp right now, because they're going so fast. There's probably not enough time to do proper documentation.
Actually, when I started, I was surprised by how much documentation they had, because I was like, when I started before at Engager, it was kind of like the CEO was like, code explains itself. So I kind of expected this again. I was like, okay, I'm going to startup, and then Dieter, my CTO, he was like, oh yeah, we have all these videos explaining some parts of the code, and then there's like on Confluence, there's like every core thing in DataCamp is actually really well explained. And there's some that needs an update, but most of it is indeed good, well documented, because they do know that because we are growing, and so they need new people, and like if we have it somewhere where everybody can just go look at it and be like, okay, that's how it works, then they will lose less time than having to explain it every time. So we do plan for the future. He did tell me like, okay, if you can update the things that you saw, that you read or you saw that were outdated, just take some time and update it. So I was surprised, but yeah, that's the one. That's like I think it's good. It helps to start very fast in a new company. Yeah, I really like it.
Yeah, I think the onboarding process for new developers is really important.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm almost out of questions. I think maybe one more is how important is the community for DataCamp, for like the R community or the Python community or the Ruby community to keep the projects alive that they're using.
So the Python community, that's pretty new to them because they just released Python. So before they were really only R focused, and the R community it's really important to them. When they release a new course, they will also first talk to the DHH of R and go and be like, okay, what do you think of this? Do you approve this? And then they try to go to events or the conferences that are big for R. So they really try to get people involved, R bloggers. So it's like, of course, if the R community doesn't approve what they are doing, then they shouldn't be doing it. So that's really important to them. Yeah.
Okay. For you, Charles.
Yes, so open source communities are kind of very important to us, and Bloomberg do quite a lot of supporting activities. So we've held kind of hackathons starting a few years ago. The ones that I can remember, we did one for Git, one for Eclipse, Scientific Python, and next week in London there's a LLVM Clang one. Again, it's the kind of the slow move from to embracing open source, starting to make it easier for developers to contribute back, getting involved with the community, so we can kind of like give back from some of the benefit that we're getting. I mean, Bloomberg's got a very big philanthropy department, and having the hackathon days have been kind of supported by philanthropy as well. And that's kind of that's been really interesting to me as a developer, because it's kind of like using my skill kind of to help, and also kind of like getting involved. It's kind of very rewarding because you kind of rather than being just kind of inside Bloomberg working with other Bloomberg developers, you're also kind of communicating outside, and being enriched, seeing how other communities do stuff, and kind of taking some of that kind of knowledge back again. And so our team in particular are doing things in a kind of completely different way from how we were doing last year, and our small team has kind of made a commitment that we will try and open source what we do when we can. So it's kind of quite an exciting time.
Okay, Kris, open source community. How important is community for open source?
Community is crucial for open source, and there's different kind of communities. There's your user community, there's your contributor community, and as an open source developer, you really need to build that community. Sometimes that's really difficult because some of those developers are maybe one guy somewhere in Nashville, Tennessee, who has really no money to even come to FOSDEM. On the last money he has comes here, and then helping those guys, showing them around, taking them to meetups, giving them a slot on a conference so they can talk about what they're doing. That's really important for small communities to start. Hosting meetups, doing presentations about the stuff you are doing, contributing back, writing code, writing documentation. It's all stuff that you, even if you're not technical, can do to help communities grow. Niels is doing that with the Docker community and a bunch of others. We did that with, I don't know how many meetups and how many communities we've hosted at our offices or at other venues. Starting camps, Puppet camps, starting conferences. It's really mostly to build communities, and even what I do for config management camp is to get contributions from different communities together so they can learn from each other also. If you're into infrastructure as code, initially the venue we had was just the Puppet camp, and then we added the Chef people and the Sea of Engine people and Ansible people, and now it's pretty much one of the only conferences in the world where those 3-4 different communities talk to each other and learn from each other, and it's also really important that they not keep on their own island and see what they do within their own silo. So communities are really important for open source.
Okay, cool. I didn't had the philanthropy angle prior to this panel discussion, so Charles, thank you for mentioning philanthropy. I'm out of questions, so if anybody else has any questions for the panel, then feel free to ask them.
You talked about the value of config management camp. Oh, sorry.
was no conflict in the beginning. The thing I saw was that there's different communities solving similar problems, and there were things that they were rebuilding. There were things that, well, two of the stacks are in the same language. Well, Ansible and Salt in the same language, Puppet and Chevron in the same language, and there was pretty much no communication between the teams. They had similar ideas, they had similar discussions. If you saw, for example, the Ansible community was pretty much lagging 4 to 5 years, running into every single bump that the Chef and the Puppet community already had taken. And you saw that happening. Like, they're gonna run into orchestration right about now. They're gonna do queuing, and there they go. So when you see that happening, you're like, what if we put all those people in the same room and we let them talk to each other on a similar platform? And that's working. First couple of years we had really tooling tracks. Now we have tracks where we just talk about subjects. We're going to talk about testing. We're going to talk about orchestration. And the technologies are going to be mixed. So what really works for those developers is that now they can talk to people who are trying to solve a similar problem, but from a different angle. So they can learn and can also improve amongst themselves and build better tools.
I think he was the first.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. Seems that you have very big experience working with the open source. And my question is more specific. So if the devs is working with the cloud services, and he's stuck at some point, so maybe you can recommend the open source more for the cloud services because the cloud computing is new, and those people who are bringing the cloud services expecting that you go into the clouds, and is there any good effective open source developed for this towards cloud services?
Towards cloud services, you mean to consume their APIs, or you mean to look at? There's a bunch of tools out there that allow you to consume the APIs. Not sure if I can help you with a specific one. Kind of also depends on which platform you want to use.
Okay, let's take this after the questions.
maybe
then.
it's more specific. It's such a broad question that.
Okay, there was a question over there.
Yeah. So when you're hiring for your companies, do you have a problem finding engineers with enough experience or knowledge in certain technologies or open source projects? And if yes, how do you solve this problem?
I think it's for you.
I've been for a long time in the luxury situation that we were a fairly well-known open source consulting company where people just wanted to work. That's not a luxury that keeps on going. And what we see is that a lot of people who have been doing, for example, Linux for like 5 to 10 years, but have not adopted to new technologies, new monitoring toolings, infrastructure as code, containers, that they're really willing to change, and that they're looking for new opportunities, that we need to take them internally, pretty much brainwash them for like 3 to 6 months and show them how to work with our new technologies, and then they grow themselves. But it is, in a way, a matter of giving people the freedom to play with the new tools and to let them learn and let them experience what the difference is using those things, and contributing to them. As finding developers, the thing with a good developer is he has some biases regarding a language, but he doesn't really care if he's writing in Scala 1 week and then 6 months later he's in Clojure. I'm taking those examples as real example, because those are the guys that are just want to write code. The actual real problem is that we have a lot of people working for large organizations, being bored like hell, but at a pay rate that they don't want to leave their job. They're doing something they're really not liking, but because they're working for a big company, whatever, they're not going to jump ship and they're not going to start working on open source products because financially it would be different. And that's a real problem these days.
Okay, there's a question there.
Primarily for Bloomberg. Inuits. companies open source is kind of the new thing to do, which is a whole other discussion. But prior to that kind of process, did Bloomberg take the more conventional path, like paying Canonical for enterprise support, things like that, or was it a complete switch from proprietary to open source, or did you previously support it in a more traditional way?
So I think now is probably a good time to mention the disclaimer that all of my views are entirely my own. And while I work for Bloomberg, I don't speak for them. I'm not aware that we've paid Canonical for anything. I'm fairly sure we do pay Red Hat for enterprise support, and we do pay a lot of vendors for support for a lot of different things. And that's not going to change anytime soon, so it's not like we've kind of like jumped ship totally and are not going to pay vendors anything. Does that answer the question? I mean, it's kind of like, it's kind of a gradual thing. So one of the things about having a lot of supported tools is that, and me being a developer experience, is I kind of get to see two complaints which are difficult to resolve together. And one of them is like, why are we using X? There's this open source tool Y. It does everything and it's easier and it's open source and therefore it's free. And then on the other side, you get this like, GNU sort ran out of memory and crashed. Please fix it. Actually, that particular one tends to be automatically generated. It's kind of like it's open source. It's what it is. I think maybe perhaps you're using it wrong. So. With the kind of experience we've had with kind of like vendor-provided software, we like a lot of people like the fact that we've got an internal team that bought it, and they'll raise an issue with the vendor, and the vendor will get it fixed, and we'll kind of shout at them, and that's nice. And then on the other hand, hey, this is free, this thing that's far cooler. Why can't we just use it now? And you've got to kind of appreciate the cost of open source. You've got to have somebody who's prepared to kind of like figure out the best way to deploy it. If it's appropriate, what the support story is. I mean, we use Python a lot, and I packaged a new version of Python for some of our platforms that other people must not be using very much because it needed a few patches. And it's kind of like it works, and people are generally happier with that version than another commercially supported version, which I think we may still be paying money to keep the really old version still kind of supported in a very loose sense, in that we can log bugs against it, but they're not exactly going to backport any kind of packages to it. So yes, I think we pay money, and I don't think we get the most benefit from it. But the alternative is, it's like if you're going to take on deploying something open source yourself, you are taking something on. It's not free. Beer.
I think there was a question, and then there, and then 3 there. And then we're
My
going to stop.
question to Charles, are there any kind of specific fields where you're competing with the Google or the Microsoft? And what's your expectations?
I don't think we're competing very well. I don't know. I suppose I'm seeing some shaking of heads. I think. So I mean, our main product is the Bloomberg terminal, and people pay us for fast access to market data and analysis built on top of that, and yeah, nobody's providing that for free as far as I know at the moment, and our main competitors are not kind of people like that.
Then there in the corner.
Again for Bloomberg.
No, me, not Bloomberg.
Everyone in the room, whether you listen to it or not.
So are we.
Awesome. So, large company, lots of technology going back, and a more traditional IP mindset that has changed over the last 4 years. Can you talk a little bit about how you've been able to draw the lines inside Bloomberg for the IP that we care about and we can't give away because it's us, and the IP that should be out in the open source world?
So basically, it's kind of like it's all proprietary. Everything you write is proprietary. It's all ours. Don't let it out.
Right.
Unless it's not. So it's it's the exceptions which, and we've got a team that kind of approve things and you know, make sure that you kind of understand about the stuff that's going outside. And generally, there are two things. It's kind of contributing back to something that is open source, and there's developing something new that we want to open source because it showcases the technology, or because we want to build a community, or we want to kind of, you know, solve something more globally than just as for ourselves. Does that answer the?
So, sort of. I guess at the extreme ends of the spectrum, you'll have engineers working internally that have to scale in a particular way that is not Bloomberg's particular special sauce, but that from a legal perspective, they might be hesitant to give away something because it looks inherently valuable. Do you run into that kind of problem?
Yes, I don't think so, primarily because if we're going to open source something, it has to be a kind of like isolatable entity. So if there's any doubt, it's not going to be open source. So yeah, we don't hit that, I don't think, or not.
We have
Not.
to chat.
Yeah.
Okay. Then last question.
Yeah, I got for
Charles. His name is Charles.
Bloomberg. Bloomberg. All of them are developers. It's kind of related to his question. So you are starting to use open source. You are currently using or promoting open source. Can we say that you are kind of internally becoming open source in terms of we have these internal kits and the knowledge is shared within the company, not externally but within the company. So I remember a presentation from Glenn yesterday, and he mentioned these silos of information. Like you have an engineering team here and that's all, and all information is closed there and that's all. And they don't care about other engineering teams. And I don't know if Bloomberg is kind of this, or they are moving to some open source based.
I think we have disparate teams with disparate attitudes. Yeah, there's a. It's certainly been the case that some teams are kind of quite proprietorial about the code that they care about, and you know, they've got their objectives for evolving. And if you say something doesn't work in quite the way you should, they might spend more effort explaining to you why they're going in this direction than kind of like fixing something that might help you out. But I think things are generally more positive than that. So that sort of experience is kind of like dwindling a bit. And since more and more teams are kind of using Git and have made it more easy to kind of like propose patches, we've kind of actually seen teams accepting changes that you know, might have to go through that team's stringent code review, and being more open to saying, we're quite core, and so we care about quality, and here are the things that we need your kind of patch, the criteria we need your patch to meet. But now seeing that when other contributors kind of want to help fix something, actually being open to accept that. So yeah, there's been some silo-y type kind of activity. There's probably a bit of silo-iness still, but I think things are changing for the positive.
Okay, thank you. I got one more question. It's it's related to a hype. Is Bloomberg also doing AI? AI research?
Almost certainly. So many teams. What is AI? I mean, we've probably got a robot team somewhere. I mean, we're sponsoring that robotics competition.
First robotics.
Yeah. So yeah, must be.
I think. Can you predict the markets, and are you using it?
If we are, that's in our enterprise product. That's really expensive. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely there are definitely teams doing kind of analysis on top of just, you know, we don't just kind of provide you market data. We have tools that kind of do analysis. but really it's up to.
He wants to know if you do prediction.
Yeah. Well.
Not personally, I don't think.
Okay.
I'm certainly not giving out any tips.
Okay.
We do have
We-
algo trading.
Yeah, I mean we've got sort of.
Okay, cool. All right, I would say let's wrap it up. So thank you, Charles. I meant, sorry,
And
thank you,
Kris.
Bloomberg.
Now he needs to share the bottle.
Okay, here's.
Am I allowed to accept gifts? I don't think I'm allowed to accept gifts.
All right, you're not getting
We
one.
can drink it here.
Thank you, Kris. Thank you, Lien.
Thank you.
We'll figure out later. But there's a bottle here.
We'll turn the camera off.
Okay, and just a small applause for the people in the panel.